Awesome. Thank you, Christy, and thank you everybody for joining today. I am going to turn my video off while I do this, so if there is any issues with bandwidth, I don't have to worry about that. So with that, I am going to get started. So just real quick, I'm going to kind of go through an outline here. So we're going to talk about watersheds, what they are, how they're involved in Washington State, and kind of the importance behind them. Erosion control, habitat creation, integrated pest management, the impact of some pests and weeds, and then also looking at some of the aquatic weed and pest identification. This is there's a lot of information in these slides, so I'm going to try and get through everything, and we will be able to have questions at the end. And then, as Christy mentioned, this presentation and the slides will be available afterwards. And so if you do have more questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at the hotline and look at the resources that Christy has provided. So to begin, what is a watershed? That area of land, a bounded hydrological system within which all living things are inextricably linked by their common water course, and whereas humans settled, simple logic demanded that they become part of a community. So I really like this quote. It's just kind of a way of thinking about how everything comes together. All living things, water, land, everything comes together, and that is really what represents a watershed. So this just kind of looks at all of the different ways and how much water we have in Washington State. So the picture on the top left is all of those blue lines are all of the different rivers. On the bottom left is all the different lakes that we have around. So as you can see, we have lots of water that is connecting all of the different areas. And then on the far side is looking at some of the different watersheds. And this is where those rivers and those lakes come together in these specific environments. And in Bothell, specifically, you have the Snohomish watershed and the different creeks that are around it. This shows that it's just a small portion of it. It is a pretty vast type of watershed. As you can see, it comes all the way around Lake Washington. The Cedar River watershed is the one that is mostly within King County. So it's just kind of a great way to be able to see how the water from Snoqualmie comes down and then kind of forms into the watershed here, where we have the different creeks and the different environments that it all forms, and everything kind of interacts and works together. When thinking about a watershed, we think about it in many different ways, by both physical and also human managed ways, because a lot of it has to do with how it was naturally formed. So looking at the topography and the hydrology of the area, the ecology of the land, and then also some of the more human managed parts of it. So the different infrastructure that has been built in those areas, the demographics of the different populations and growth that has happened, how the land is being used, and then any sort of socio-political priorities that have been involved, such as parks or different designated areas for personal use. So this is a great kind of graphic to be able to show how the hydrological cycle works. And it's pretty interesting to watch how the evaporation comes up from, let me wait till it gets to the right spot. It keeps going here. So we have our evaporation coming up off the water. It then condenses in the clouds, moves over towards the mountain, being transported. Precipitation is formed. It comes down. It's being absorbed into the ground with groundwater, and then once again going back into the water where it started from. Or if we have an area where there is less roots or trees or vegetation, potential runoff is happening, and that is another way that that water is getting back to its original source. So part of that is important to think about when we have erosion control. So Christy was talking about some of the surface water runoff and how that can impact with different types of chemicals being washed in. As you can see here, this is just a small sampling of what it looks like if you have a shoreline erosion. You have saturated soils that make the water table quite high. If you have vegetation that is being removed, it increases the amount of runoff. You'll have soft surface water runoff that will then erode the bluffs of different areas. causing all these different problems in different ways that the shores are being changed and adapted over time. And this can also happen within a long stream. So it doesn't just have to be um, an ocean or a sound area. This can happen around lakes and in other areas too. So one of the big things to think about with erosion control is really thinking about vegetation and the impact that it has in minimizing that amount of erosion. Roots are one of the best ways to help hold and stabilize different soil. It helps to absorb the groundwater so that you don't have that water table and extra surface water hanging on, which can then loosen soil and have it erode down. It helps to slow the velocity of any of that runoff by holding that soil and making it slowly trickle through. Think of it kind of like a pinko board, if anyone knows what that is. That's bouncing back and forth rather than just sloping straight down like if you were on a slide. It absorbs the energy of the rain falling. So as the water is coming down, it's not pounding and creating compaction. It's having to bounce through the different grass blades. It's having to bounce off the different tree branches. And then it also helps to remove water from soil and transpires into the air. So with that, it's helping to kind of shift that transpiration cycle and getting that water back up into the clouds and over into all the rest of the different areas that we have within a watershed. So just a quick list. There's a lot of different plants out there. These are some of our native plants that can help with different streamside erosion control. And these do well in the more moist areas. They do well with stabilizing and holding the soil. So whether they have a deeper tap root of sorts, or if they have a more spreading root system, it helps to hold that soil in place in those different areas along streams that can be more delicate and more prone to some type of erosion. The evergreens are great also to be able to help shade and cool the water. A lot of the deciduous trees also can help shade the water. And as the leaves fall, they help to add to the habitat by being a food source for different microorganisms, beneficial insects, and also for different beetles, and also oftentimes for other types of birds and other animals. When looking at shoreline specifically, so this is more in saltwater kind of areas, these guys can handle some of the little bit more rough types of weather. Sometimes it can be on those areas. And once again, with the evergreens and the deciduous being important to have that diversity so that as you're going through, you're creating different levels of habitat creation for different animals to help with different pest management practices, and also just with creating that habitat for not only the mammals and the birds and the insects and the bugs, but also for the different types of trees and shrubs. When thinking about the value of native plants, so these are oftentimes some of the best ones that we recommend if we can for different areas, because they are really accustomed to our weather. They know that we and are used to our wet winters and our really dry summers. Oftentimes people forget that we have dry summers, but generally from the end of June through the beginning of September, we have no rain. And these plants need to be able to survive in that weather because they don't have an irrigation system built into that native landscape. They are a great opportunity and great source of food and shelter for different wildlife. Most native plants are what animals are used to seeing and used to eating. So those animals are going to be able to gravitate toward those and be able to survive through all the seasons by knowing when things are blooming, when things are producing berries, to be able to find the best way to interact with them. Oftentimes, because of our dry summers, they are more drought tolerant. They're used to that weather, so they're going to be hardier. They're going to do better in those types of environments. And because of all of that too, they're used to our types of soils. They oftentimes need less fertilizer, which then also means they also need less pesticides. They are used to the types of insects that might be pests or the different types of diseases that potentially are going to be impacting them. So if at all possible, it's always best to try and plant those native plants to really help to add to that diversity and increase that types of habitat that you are trying to create in your homes. We really like to focus on trees a lot because they are what we call our environmental heroes. Those roots are oftentimes huge, vast networks that are helping to stabilize that soil. They're really holding that soil in place and making sure that we don't have that erosion. They are there year round, they're there for long periods of time. And that really helps to help with that stormwater runoff that Christy was mentioning too, by helping to kind of filter and move some of that nutrients and chemicals through. They provide shelter and food for all different types of wildlife and other organisms by not only having their leaves in the winter or in the summertime for shade and for shelter for some birds from different predators. Some of the evergreens will have ways to be able to shelter through the snow when we do get it, to protect some of those different animals. They clean the air and they cool the environment. When those leaves out in the summertime, they're shading the area down below. And if you look at maps that show the heat levels in urban cities that have very little plant life versus more rural areas that have more plant life, the actual surface temperature is drastically higher when there is little trees compared to more trees. So they cool that air as they're absorbing and transpiring, they're cooling that air. They always add beauty. They really help to add to a landscape. And we always like to make sure that people remember to choose a tree that is appropriate for the size of your landscape. It's really easy to try and get a tree that says it'll be 20 or 30 feet tall. And you're like, oh, it's okay. I'll just prune it down. I'll keep it intact. But it's really, you're going to be fighting the tree. The tree is always going to want to grow to that size. And it can damage or reduce the vigor of a tree if you're constantly trying to keep it into a shape or a size that you want. So it is always best, if you can, to try and find something that is best for that location. It helps to reduce the amount of potential pest or disease issues that those plants are going to have too, so that they're not stressed out. One of the things that we also like to say is that soil is, and healthy soil more particularly, is kind of like the plant's immune system, is the way that I like to think about it. Plants need a healthy soil to be able to survive, to be able to fend off diseases and pests, and to be the healthiest that they can be. And as you build that healthy soil, you're helping to reduce that amount of need for any sort of chemicals, fertilizers, and pesticides, because those plants are getting the nutrients that they need and they don't need that extra inputs being put in. It reduces the amount of irrigation because healthy soil is able to hold more moisture. The higher organic matter is kind of like a sponge. It helps to hold that moisture. So because of that too, it's helping to filter out different pollutants that might go through. It's a slow process as it works its way down, and each level of the soil, from coarse down to finer, starts to filter out different types of pollutants. It helps to sequester stormwater, so it slows down that process of that rainwater running off, and it helps to slow it through. And it is a huge carbon store from the atmosphere. So it's another just good way and good reason to build and maintain healthy soil. It is one of the best things that you can do. And if you haven't, I definitely recommend getting soil tests to see what your nutrient levels are, your pH, your organic matter percentage, and just get a basic idea of what type of soil you have so that you can work on trying to create the best type for your plants and for your households. Mulch is one of the ways that really does help to not only build healthy soil, but also helps to protect any sort of bare soil that you might have in your landscape, which also helps to prevent any sort of erosion and compaction issues that you might have down the road. Wood chips are great for perennials, trees, shrubs, ground covers, and paths. They're one of the best ways to be able to do that. They are slow to breaking down, so they last a little bit longer. Different composts are really great for vegetable gardens and annual beds, mainly because they have a lot more nutrients in them. They also are a little bit smaller. They break down quicker, so they can be mixed into those gardens later on at the end of the season. Straw is wonderful. It is slower to break down, so it protects the soil. It's kind of like a blanket and kind of works its way into the different vegetable gardens. I like to use it around stuff because it's easy to pull away, store, and put back again. And it does take quite a long time to break down, so it's one that you can kind of use over and over again. Leaves are great for everything. I never want people to rake them up unless there is some sort of disease issue that you know about with them. In that case, you do want to get rid of them and get them off your property because you don't want those diseases to linger. But leaves are a great source. It's a free mulch. They break down, they create a leaf mold, which is actually a good mold. And it's just a whole bunch of mycorrhizae forming and different fungi that are creating a beneficial relationship with the root systems of many of the different plants that you have at your properties. There's different commercial mixes. They can either be a manure-based type of a compost or a wood or yard waste type of manures that are out there, or of composts. Burlap is a great way to protect an open area kind of in between different seasons. Oftentimes you'll see them on vegetable beds. Sheet mulching is great for not only weed and grass suppression, but also soil building and transforming a lawn or an area that is maybe a little bit more compact and needs a longer term solution. Sheet mulching is just taking cardboard or newspaper and doing like a lasagna layer of soil, compost, and mulch on top. And it slowly breaks down, builds really healthy, good soil, and then you can plant in it later down the road. And then lastly, cover crops. And these are great for not only veggie beds, which is where you commonly see them, but also in pots or in bare areas that maybe you're not quite ready to plant. You don't ever want to leave your soil bare. And so it's a great way to put in a crop that can either help to break up really clay hard soil or to help hold any sort of loose soil in place with the root system, protecting from any erosion. And then once again, turning it into your soil at the end, cutting it down. It's adding organic matter. It's a free mulch compost that you're mixing in at the end. So it's a great option to protect that soil and help to just continue to increase and build your healthy soil. So next, looking at habitat creation. Habitat is an environment that is occupied by a particular species of plant, animal, or any kind of other organism. It's pretty much any space that you have outside where there are multiple things working together, where something is living, is going to be a habitat. There's hundreds of different types out there. Some of the things to think about for creating, or what we call ingredients of a healthy habitat, looking at different types of food sources. There's different types of animals that need different types of food. Nectar, you can get food for different animals from fallen fruit. There's a lot of different bees that will eat kind of rotting fruit. There's different plants that need a specific type of larva, such as the monarch butterfly needs the milkweed for their larva to be able to survive. For looking at shelter, different canopy layers. The tallest trees, you'll see a lot of eagles or other stuff in. You'll have the mid-level where you'll have robins or different sparrows that'll be living in. Different snags or dead wood are going to be for your woodpeckers. Bare soil beetles, different groups of plants. So having different types of stuff grouped together, protecting and creating shelter or habitat. Thinking about water, oftentimes people forget about the need for water for different types of animals. And it's mainly because we see a bird bath and we think, okay, the bird's there, but different insects need it too. And one of the things that people forget about is some of the different bees or the slower flying animals need really shallow types of ways to get into the water, or putting rocks or something so that they have something to land on to be able to get to that water. So just think about that when you're trying to create a healthy habitat. And then of course, nesting. And nesting could be anything from a man-made nest box that you put out, or just leaving some of those different snags or dead wood for any of the cavity guys to get themselves into. So part of the reason why we have the wildlife habitat is because they're also helping to create our predators for the different types of pests that we have. Oftentimes people forget about all the different types of ones that are out there, and there's a couple of examples. Garter snakes eat slugs. So it's a great one to have in your garden. Try and make a little home for them. They need those grassy areas, warm sunning spots. They also like to have kind of some sort of covered, taller grass area that they can kind of hide around in. Most people know about the lady beetle, or commonly known as the ladybug. They need different types of plant material to be able to lay their eggs on. And then also, as much as we don't want aphids in our yards, it is also one of their main food sources. So sometimes it's good to have a little bit of pests so that you can have the food for the predators to help maintain those populations. And then bumblebees need actually bare earth. They generally kind of burrow in types of areas that, I know I said cover all your bare soil, but keeping a couple of little corners here and there helps to be able to make sure that they're there. Bumblebees are one of the best for pollinating tomatoes. So it's always a good one to make sure you have some bumblebees around. Just some other couple examples. When looking at blue herons, they really need those really large trees for nesting, and oftentimes pretty enclosed, dense areas. They eat a lot of really large insects, along with all of the different types of fish that they eat. They are eating many different types of food. Hoverflies, although they look kind of scary like a yellow jacket, they are completely harmless and they are a fly. And their larvae are actually huge predators for different types of aphids, and the adults are also pollinating different types of flowers. Bats are another great one, and they eat, as you can see here, 600 to 1,000 insects per hour. So they're super important to have around and a great one to try and incorporate into your landscape. There's different types of nest boxes that they have around that are great for being able to kind of help attract them or give them a space to live. And I just want to touch a little bit on amphibians since we are talking about streamside areas. They're ones that people oftentimes don't think about as much, but they really need a dry, flat area with a slope that's less than 6%, and that kind of leads to an unnatural looking wetland. They need a space where they can kind of have their water and their dry. So one of the things that you can think about is you can also create different ephemeral wetlands, which is a dry part of the year and wet other part of the year, and help retain water during part of the time, because that is, they're breeding in the water, but then living in the dry. So thinking about how to decide on how your wetland will retain water. So there's different ways that you can do this by digging shallow holes. You can line them with different plastic liners that are good for aquatic wildlife, such as pond liners. You can do natural ladders and have cover and shade. Looking at finding some of those native plants to help surround the area and protect them. Making sure you're very careful and not using pesticides or weed killers. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more later. They're really, a lot of the pesticides and chemicals are really harmful to our aquatic animals. Making sure that you're not bringing in something from a different area. We have a lot of invasive species that are around that are starting to impact our natives. Even though it seems like they might be okay, they're oftentimes out competing for food or even some habitat areas. And like I said, there's lots more of this information on the resources. This is just barely touching on this. So going into the integrated pest management. So this is really important. Integrated pest management is a sustainable approach to managing pests by combining biological, cultural, physical, and chemical tools in a way that minimizes the economic, health, and environmental risks. And it's just kind of something to think about, that it's kind of like, think about Mother Nature and how she's working. She's working together to the best of her ability by incorporating many different techniques. And that's kind of what we want to look at too. So why do we do this? So like I said, think about Mother Nature in a way. Also think about that pesticides are designed to kill organisms. And we've had an increase in pesticide use between 64 and 82, when a lot of the more kind of larger farmlands were growing. And then in crop production, we ended up having a 37% reduction each year by negative pest effects. And so what ends up happening is the more pesticides we use, the less beneficial insects that are around, because it's a non-target organism, and it ends up hitting a whole bunch of the other good stuff. So we end up having to use more of the bad stuff. Another thing to think about is oftentimes the active ingredients are the ones that are killing those organisms, or killing the weed or the pest that they're trying to kill. But there's 95% other ingredients that aren't necessarily required to be listed, and they can be just as toxic as you start adding them all together. So just something to always think about. It's always a risk to humans, to our pets, and to the environment as we start to add all of these in together. So with the IPM steps, we want to think about prevention and making sure that we're creating a healthy landscape. Think about observation, monitor for issues throughout the year, tolerance, how bad is that issue really? And then lastly, thinking about intervention. And if there is a treatment, starting with the least impact and using an organic chemical if needed at the very, very last resort. So we think about eradication versus control versus management. And the eradication was the original intent of those pesticides. Get rid of those completely, make them go away. But as we do that, we start to remove the beneficial insects. We start to remove different types of animals that are kind of working together and creating a balanced ecosystem. And then also as you're doing that, some of those pests are actually a food source for those other things. So you're reducing those good guys because of that also. Control is a newer kind of way of looking at it by using the pesticides every so often or more focused. And so we got a little bit better. But really what we're trying to do is think about it as management, as thinking about how nature is really working together to create a balance in our ecosystem. So when thinking about prevention, that's kind of the main work that we're doing when we're gardening. So like I mentioned, healthy soil, using compost, using different types of mulches, helping to build that soil, create and up that immune system of the different plants, making sure you're planting the right plants in the right place. So as I mentioned, the trees in the right spaces, making sure you're putting stuff where they're supposed to be, the right type of water, the right amount of sun, so that they are healthy and not fighting to survive. Mulching is really important to not only conserve soil moisture and prevent runoff, it's also really helping to prevent weeds. Most weeds are opportunistic and they want to come around and find a bare spot. They're going to find any kind of newly scraped up soil and they're just going to put those roots in and grow. So they don't like healthy soil generally. They want to find a disturbed kind of low nutrient area. Making sure that you're removing any sort of diseased or pest infested plant material from the landscape so you're not contributing to it spreading around the area. And so really keeping an eye on the different spots that you have so that you're kind of watching each of those little areas and catching them when they're a small kind of issue rather than it taking over an entire plant. Diversity is super important, as I mentioned, not only for habitat creation, but also just to be able to have beauty in the landscape, helping with different types of pest and disease issues. By having that diversity, you're creating habitat, you're creating a different type of ecosystem that can help kind of fend off some of those other types of issues. And then watering really properly is really important. We try to recommend to people and have them do water in the morning as much as possible. It allows the plants to absorb the water, allows the leaves to dry off and reduce any sort of possible disease issues. It also is the best time for the plants to be able to absorb that water as they slow down and kind of shut down a little bit when it's super hot and sunny outside. They're protecting and holding that moisture in. It also allows the soil to absorb the water more fully. If you try and water in the middle of the day when it's really hot and sunny, you're going to have some of that water evaporate almost immediately. So if you can, watering in the morning. And then deeply is also super important. And it's a term that we say is water deeply and less often. So if you water a little bit more, less often, that water is going down farther. Those root systems are reaching down farther into the soil. They're more stable. They're absorbing more nutrients. You're having to water less because that water is deeper and it's not evaporating as quickly. So it's just another great practice to think about when you are looking at not only the prevention, but also taking care of your landscape. Observation, this is probably one of the best other things that you can do. Just taking some time and wandering around your garden, taking the time to just be present, observe what your plants are doing, what insects are around, what's the soil doing, and really just taking it all in. Many of the different plants have mature sizes and shapes. So thinking about that, looking at the soil and the sun, the water needs of those different plants, understanding what they need before you put them in will help you to know how to take care of them to the best way that they can to survive. So you won't be fighting them. Thinking about the different life cycles of pests. So then this top picture here, this is a stink bug. So stink bug have what we call instars. And so they go from eggs to a baby beetle or to a baby stink bug, and then they go on up and they kind of morph and change in their color and their shape, but they are still going within that same type of a cycle. So they're a simple stink bug, eggs to nymphs to adults. And then the complete is going to be going from a full transformation. So different butterflies and moths are some of the most common examples. So the imported cabbage worm is actually a butterfly. It's not a moth. And it goes from its egg to the larva, to the pupa, to the adult. And so knowing these, you know when to find them, how they reproduce, where they're going to be located, how fast they can reproduce. Think about the different life cycles of weeds. So are they an annual? Do they just come around 1 year? Are they a biennial? Do they grow a full amount of foliage and then they go to seed the second year? Or are they a perennial that just comes back year after year? Do they have a taproot, such as a dandelion, or do they have a fibrous root system, such as a ranunculus or the buttercup? Knowing this helps you to know how to control them, helps you to know when the best time of year is to control them. So making sure you do a little bit of research and studying these. There is great information on the different noxious weed websites about this. The WSU invasive species websites have great information on the different types of insects and bugs around. So really doing some research and looking into that is going to help you with fighting and combating these different types of issues that might be happening in your own garden. Tolerance. Everybody needs to have a little bit of a tolerance. We in the Northwest have some types of issues that are just always going to be here because of our environment. And they aren't always going to kill a plant. They might just be cosmetic. Sometimes they will be life-threatening. So knowing when you need to kind of figure out if you need to do something or not, learning what those different tolerances are for the different plants. Something such as a rust on hollyhocks is super common, but it happens towards the end of the year when they're already towards the end of their life cycle for that year. So cutting them down, removing that rust out of the garden, and then it will come back beautiful the next year. So think about these different types of things when you're looking at your garden, taking note. Sometimes making a garden journal is a good way to kind of think about this. When did the different types of diseases come out? Powdery mildew, when does it come out? In the spring and the fall. So thinking about the different types of plants it affects, what type of year, what level through their life cycle is it happening, to be able to think about if something needs to be happening with it or not. Is the damage temporary? Will the plant grow back out of it? So a lot of times with some of these different disease issues that are common in the Northwest, at least, that you will see year after year, oftentimes it is a temporary damage and it's not going to permanently kill a plant. Sometimes it can be too bad and it will. So just knowing that and thinking about that. And then wondering too, maybe the plant needs to be moved. Maybe you need to get rid of it altogether because it is constantly having this problem. It's constantly stressed and it's never going to be its perfect self. And then think about when to intervene. So, what level of your tolerance have you hit? Are you at a level where you're constantly fighting and you're doing more work to try and keep something alive than it is worth having? Looking at the different types of plant choices and placement, thinking about those cultural conditions, and then looking at what the possible hands-on treatments are: mechanical, biological, or chemical. And chemical does include any sort of organic products also. So cultural is looking at adjusting the way the plant is being grown or the environment it's at. So watering, increasing airflow if fertilizing needs to happen, soil moisture levels. Mechanical is when you're actually physically removing something and getting rid of it. So if you're pulling weeds before they go to seeds, or if you're trying to trap those different slugs. Biological is oftentimes looking at different types of beneficial insects or pesticides, which I will go into more next week. And then also looking at some of the different bacterias or fungi that are around that have been used to kind of target some of the different pests that are out there. So an example is the BTK or the Bacillus thuringiensis subspecies Kerstaki. Probably did not pronounce any of that right, but it's been used and has helped to control different tent caterpillars. It is also important to note that any of the biologicals can also impact some other insects or different types of organisms. So it's always good to read labels and make sure that you're not just spraying on everything and you know exactly what you are treating before you do that. And then chemicals uses the very last resort and the lowest toxicity as possible. Something just even as vinegar is toxic and is still a chemical. So be very cautious. It can burn you. It can also kill different beneficial organisms in the soil. So make sure that you are using it as a very last resort. And oftentimes the cultural issue is what's going on. And so focusing on that in the very first time is the best way to do it. So next, looking at the impact of the pests and weeds that we have around. So just real quick, a note about what invasive species are. And they are any type of plant, animal, or organism that spread quickly and that can harm the different wildlife that are around. They're oftentimes not native and they were brought here from somewhere else. And because they are new to the area, they don't have a natural predator, which allows them to spread very quickly. They oftentimes outcompete native plants and animals. They are very damaging to farms and forests, including our rivers, our lakes, and our marine waters. They cost billions of dollars to try and control, and many people are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to try and control them themselves. So they're one of the leading threats to the world's diversity of plants and animals. And so it's one of the really important reasons why we focus on this so much is because if we don't, they're going to change our entire landscape. So just to kind of give you an idea with the state noxious weed law, I don't want to go over this too much, but it does require property owners to control the spread of certain designated weeds on their property, in both aquatic and non-aquatic. And it applies equally to private and public property. There are 3 different classifications that are decided by distribution. Class A weeds are the highest priority, and that's because they're highly limited in distribution. So the way that they do it is the ones that are more controlled by the government are the Class A because they can wipe them out and eradicate them more quickly. Class Bs have a split distribution, and they're only required if they are not already widespread. And then Class C are the most widespread, and their control is typically not required, but although recommended. So as an example, Class C weeds, you're looking at something like blackberries and English ivy. And that is because there's so much of it out there. We would never be able to stop any of their weeds around if we focused all of our energy on those, which is why it's so important for homeowners to try and tackle those so that they don't continue to spread. And you can learn more at the Washington's Noxious Weed website. And every year they are adjusting and changing the different lists of the weeds that are to be managed and the different classes that they're in as they go through and eradicate them. So thinking about aquatic plants, they are many different kinds that are native and provide food and habitat to not only fish and birds, but also other wildlife. They protect shorelines from erosion, and they clean and pollute they clean pollution from the water. There's 3 different kinds that they are classified in. Emergent plants, which are rooted in the soil and grow along shorelines. Floating plants, which grow in shallow to deep water, and then either have floating leaves or form floating mats on their surface. And then also submerged plants, which mostly grow underwater. Looking at different invasive weeds along waterways, and the reason that we focus on these is because there is a loss of native plants to them. They're disrupting the habitat of not only fish, but also wildlife. They're damaging different commercial and sport fishing areas, reducing recreational activities, clogging irrigation and drinking water structures, and also the decreasing water quality. So one thing that is very important to think about is, unlike other areas, the permit requirements are pretty strict for any sort of aquatic weed control. And so you need to be very careful when you are looking at doing any sort of chemical treatment, and if just doing any sort of removal in any sort of aquatic areas, because oftentimes the shorelines are very easily disturbed and very sensitive. So it's important to pay attention to that as you go through. You can look at the hydraulic project approval for getting permits for doing anything around the water. And then also regarding sort of herbicide use, making sure that you're looking at the Washington Department of Ecology and Department of Agriculture for more information. So to go over just real quick, kind of the impact of pesticides on the environment, oftentimes it's a pretty long process as it goes through, but anywhere you spray something, some runoff, as Christy mentioned, it's making its way down into our watershed, it's making our way into our streams and our lakes. And so it goes through the entire process of being evaporated up, transpiring down, and then running back through. And it can take a long time. And so oftentimes we don't see the issues until later on down the road. And so here's just kind of another look at the different ways that this is becoming a problem. It can take a really long time for it to finally get to our water supply or to somewhere else. It can take months, it could take years. So just thinking about that before you start doing anything. Looking at reducing your impact if you are working in the water by removing, cleaning any sort of boats or anything you have going on, making sure that you're detecting and reporting anything that you see, making sure you are reporting and removing any sort of seed heads before they mature is some of the biggest ways that you can start to reduce that impact of spreading these invasive species. So lastly, just looking at some of the different aquatic weed and different pests that we have out there. So just real quick, looking at some of these, the common reed is, its largest impact is displacing the wetland hydrology and the structure. And it's also reducing the water quality around different areas. And it's one that you can do just by cutting it back at the end of July when it's kind of at its weakest. Garden loosestrife can form really dense stands, and which then is wiping out our native areas along wetlands and different shorelines. And it can be covered with black plastic or a heavy tarp. You just want to make sure you really secure those edges, because any light that comes up, it will kind of work its way around. And I should mention too, with a lot of these, there is many other types of control measures. These were just some of the ones that I decided were going to be the best for a homeowner to be able to do without having to do too many more steps. But definitely go to the nwcb.washington.gov and it will give you some more information about different control measures. Purple loosestrife has been dominating different wetlands. It's impeding water flow in irrigation ditches. It's a prolific seed production and seedling survival, so it's displacing a lot of native vegetation, which then is impacting habitat and food sources for different wildlife. There is actually a beetle that is a two-foliar feeding beetle that has been shown to be the most effective. You can also cut it down, pull it, and bag it to get rid of it. It's another one that you can do that way. Reed canary grass is outcompeting most of the native species, and it's also invading into different irrigation ditches, which is causing issues with that. And it can be mowed down to control. Always removing seed heads on any of these before they go to seed is going to help with any of this. And then also, because once the seeds are exposed to light, they will start to go again, to grow again. Knotweed is, there's 3 different kinds that are most common in Snohomish and King County. The giant one, which is on the left, the Japanese in the middle, and the Bohemian on the right. And they are displacing native plant species, and they grow very quickly. They have a really rapid early season growth, and they're competing for water and nutrients. And then they have a really extensive root system, a rhizome root system. It is very difficult to remove, and it can be cut in multiple times to be effective. But any rhizomes that are broken off can will grow back again. So it can be removed. It just takes multiple times of going after it. Yellow flag iris is actually can cause skin irritation and is harmful to different livestock if it is ingested. So if and when you do see this, it's very pretty, but it is causing a huge problem. And be very careful if and when you do remove this, because the resins from it can burn you. So make sure you're wearing good protection, long sleeves, and a mask to make sure that you're not getting any of those resins on you, and removing as much of the rhizomes as possible because they can continue to spread. The fragrant water lily can restrict lakefront access and eliminate swimming opportunities, and then is out competing different native aquatic vegetation. Because this plant is fully in the water, do make sure that you are getting permits before you're doing anything with this, even if you're not using a chemical, because they are sensitive environments that these are growing in. So continually removing the leaves as they emerge, killing the plants after a few seasons, cutting the material can help with these guys. And I should mention that most of these, or a lot of these, did come in as ornamentals at one point, or at least a lot of invasive species do. They come in through plant nurseries and then they get out of control. So it's just kind of what happens, unfortunately, as they get outside of someone's house, they all of a sudden get out into our landscapes. The Eurasian water milfoil, it forms really dense mats which shades out aquatic plants, which then changes the water quality and the water flow. It is a bottom barrier that you can use to cover the patches of the water milfoil. They have this type of fabric that you can put down, and that helps to kind of shade them out completely. The Brazilian Elodia forms a dense mat similar to the water milfoil, and once again, it's shading out native aquatic plants and inhibits water flow and impacts recreational activities. Small infestations can be controlled with the use of an opaque fabric that blocks out the light from the plant. The butterfly bush is a really common one that you will see all over the place, the city, anywhere. It's one of those hard ones where they were sold in plant nurseries for a very long time, and now they have seen that they spread very quickly and are taking over, and so they've been taken off and added to the noxious weed list. There is still sometimes some available for sale, but they are a sterile variety, so they will not produce seed, which is the most common way that these are reproducing. What's happening is that they're actually displacing natives, and especially along streams and irrigation canals is where the biggest problem is, and it's changing the habitat for many different types of animals. So removing those flowers, cutting them down, fully removing them is the best thing that you can do. And I know it's hard because they are great for pollinators, but they're becoming more of an impact and a detriment than anything. Many people know English ivy. They have that shallow root system, which does not actually hold the soil down. And since they fully can take over an area, they're making the areas more prone to erosion, and they're displacing other plants as they kind of make a carpet. Another thing that's not noted on this is, as you've probably seen, they will kind of wind themselves around trees, and they can actually strangle and take down trees. So you can cut the vines about 2 or 3 feet up from the base, and you want to go all the way through that stem, and then actually cut about an inch gap in between the stems out so that they can actually fuse back together again. And that will help to kill off the vine that goes up if you can, or pulling any of those bits off to help kind of unstrangle the trees or areas will be very helpful in controlling them. Giant hogweed. This is another one of those plants that is poisonous and can hurt you. So be very careful when and if you do see this, and try and take care of it. It forms really dense canopies that displaces natives, and then because of that is increasing the risk of soil erosion because of their shallow root system. So you can dig them out when they're small. going down and removing as much of the central root as possible. But once again, make sure you're wearing protective clothing because their sap can burn you. The Himalayan blackberry, most people are familiar with, and it takes over many areas, especially different natives, and it is preventing water flow into streams as it starts to kind of creep around and make really dense fields or areas. It can be controlled by repeatedly cutting it in the fall. So, kind of end of September when the fruit is out after it's done flowering, all of its reserves of energy has gone into that fruit and flower. And so the root system is at its weakest. So, cutting it and digging it up then, just being very careful because as you remove any of these in the fall, you're going into the winter rain season with this potential loose soil. So, tackling stuff, making sure you have something planted or a new system set up so that you're not going to have bare soil after you have removed any of these is going to be helpful in reducing sort of erosion control. So next, just kind of looking at some of the animals. So I focused on some of the mammals, and I actually wanted to start with beavers because they are oftentimes a nuisance for a lot of people, but they also create habitat and are actually very important to have around. So we have to kind of look at the tolerance of living with some of these different animals too. So in the winter, deer and elk frequent beaver ponds to forage on shrubbery plants that grow where beavers have cut down trees for food to use to make their dams and lodges. Weasels, raccoons, and herons hunt for frogs and other prey along the marshy edges of beaver ponds. And many migratory water birds use beaver ponds as nesting areas and resting stops during migration. Ducks and geese often nest on top of beaver lodges since they offer warmth and protection. Especially when lodges are formed in the middle of a pond, the trees that die as a result of rising water levels attract insects, which in turn feed woodpeckers, whose holes later provide homes for other wildlife. So, as you can see, even though they can be a nuisance, they are very important to have. And so, looking at tolerance when we're looking at different animals too. So then looking at the impact. So because of all of the good that there is, they also are eating different types of trees that people might have in their landscapes. They might be flooding out different areas of a property or damaging different areas of the property. So thinking about control, there are some plants that they don't like. So Sitka spruce, elderberry, cascara, Indian plum, ninebark, twinberry. You can all plant those around closer to the areas where they might be. Densely planting aspen, cottonwood, willow, spirea, red twig dogwood, because those roots are well established, the upper parts can be eaten and they resprout very easily. The trunks of individual large trees can be loosely wrapped with a 3-foot high kind of chicken wire or hog wire, and that will help to protect from the beavers actually munching and chewing on their bark. River otters are opportunistic. They eat a wide variety of food, but mostly fish. So oftentimes you're going to see them going after carp or minnows, different suckers. And so they're kind of also can be found for spawning salmon. So another reason why it's important to keep in mind with these guys. Oftentimes the biggest impact is that they will go after people's private ponds. They also start to make dens under houses and decks, which can be really smelly, and they can also be really leave scraps and other stuff all around and be really messy at the same time. So you can put 4-foot high fences around with different mesh around any sort of area where you might have fish or different aquaculture. And then also making sure that any areas under your houses or areas where they might be able to try and den up, that you're covering that with some sort of chicken wire or hog wire will help with them. Rats is not only a common problem for waterways, but also just urban areas. There's 2 different types of rats that we call old world rats. The Norway rat, also known as the brown rat or the sewer rat or the wolf rat, and then the black rat, which is the roof rat. So these are the 2 most common ones we have around. As many people know, they will get into pretty much everything. They chew on electrical wires, structural supports. The Norway rats will also actually dig and burrow. So they end up then causing problems with that. They get into garden crops and ornamental plantings. So some of the best things that you can do for these guys is really preventing access to food and water. So that's making sure that you're not leaving your compost uncovered and contained. You're not leaving dog and food outside, chicken food. You're making sure bird feeders are not dropping everywhere. They also kind of making sure they can't climb and get into buildings. They also like to run along straight lines with really dense um, hedges. So, say, for example, a boxwood hedge, if it's boxwood hedge along the side of your house, they love to run along and under that. So, thinking about that, they don't like open areas quite so much. So, having some little pockets of open will keep them from coming around you. The nutria. The nutria are semi-aquatic rodents. They look kind of like a beaver. They're kind of like a cross between a beaver and a large rat, kind of sort of. You find them in lakes and wetlands, drainage ditches, um, and some of the biggest problems with them is burrowing and the feeding that they do. So they weaken road beds and stream banks. The soil will then kind of collapse underneath because of it, and then you have a lot of different types of erosion issues from them. So making sure that you're putting up fences or barriers around different sections to keep them away. And then also the fluctuations in water levels, if you have a way to adjust that, they don't like the fluctuations. And then also discouraging by keeping the slopes at a 3-to-1 or less of a ratio. It makes it harder for them to get up and down it. And then just controlling any sort of extensive vegetation growth. And then, like I said, some sort of embankment barriers to kind of keep them from burrowing and getting around too much. And then raccoons. I'm pretty sure everybody has seen a raccoon before. And they really do prefer the forested areas. That's where they're meant to be. But they have kind of moved their ways into a lot of different urban environments because of the different types of food that they're able to find, and with a lot of their natural habitat being changed. So they really are having a huge issue on getting to people's garbage cans, vegetable gardens. They love fish ponds, chicken coops, and they will find their ways into attics and chimneys or different crawl spaces. So being very careful with them. They also can be very dangerous and also have rabies. So it's important to keep an eye out for these guys. Don't feed them. Is one of the biggest things that you can do. And preventing conflicts by modifying their habitat so that they don't want to be in your house or around your house. Really contain any sort of containers you have, making sure they're really tied down tight. Don't leave any sort of barbecue areas messy. They love chicken coops, and making sure a chicken coop and all your chickens are secured safely. Fencing in sort of orchards or vegetable gardens. One thing that's worked for my dad at his house is putting metal tubes around the fruit trees in the orchard so they can't climb up it. So it's a way to keep them out of it. You can put different kind of protecting the different nest boxes you might have and the different bird feeders. So making it hard for them to get the food, not leaving stuff out for them is going to be the best way that you can do that. So I know that was a lot, but like I said, please reach out if you have more questions. And also all of the different resources that are on the Bothell website will be more information than you will know what to do with. And I hope that you all were able to retain some of all of that information.
Yes, and we will post those slides on our website probably at some point tomorrow, as well as a recording of the video. You mentioned a few additional websites that I didn't have on the resource page before, so I was able to add those. So that should be up to date also. So now it looks like we're ready to begin the Q&A session, and that's scheduled until 8:30. We've gotten a few questions in the chat box, but if you haven't had a chance and you really want to ask a question, please feel free, and Selena will get to as many of them as she can. If we have a question about your question, then we'll ask you to unmute. And if time runs out and we're not able to get to all of the questions, you can always contact the garden hotline, either online or by phone using the information that you see on the screen. So we're going to leave this screen up throughout the Q&A session. And I think now is also a good time to launch the second set of poll questions that we have. I believe it's just 5 or so questions. And as a reminder, if you answer these questions, you'll be entered into a prize drawing for a gardening book or a 90-minute online consultation, most likely with Selena, but if not, then with one of her coworkers at Tilth Alliance. So let's go ahead and launch that poll. And while you're doing that, I'm going to look at the questions that we've gotten so far. All right, hold on one moment.
Okay, poll is going.
Cool, thank you. Okay, we have a question about mulch, specifically if you're going to use leaves as mulch. Do you recommend mowing the leaves first to break them down before putting them over the dirt area, or should you just leave them whole?
That's a great question. I would say if it's a more leathery, harder leaf, so like say a big leaf maple, a rhododendron, a laurel even, definitely mow them if you can, because it takes them so long to break down that oftentimes we want them to break down in a season. So breaking those ones down, something like a Japanese maple, or a birch or something that's a little bit lighter, you can leave whole. It is a great way if you can mow them. It helps with all of it, but definitely those harder and thicker leaf ones. I should mention too, if you're going to use, there's a couple you don't want to use, the black walnut and also black locust. They have properties that can inhibit germination. And so if you have seeds or something that you're trying to germinate, they won't let you do that. So
Okay, there was a follow-up question to that, but you answered it. And the question
yeah.
was, are rhododendron leaves good to use as leaf mulch? And you mentioned
Yeah.
rhododendron.
Yep, rhododendrons are great. They just are thicker, so they just take a longer time.
And a question, do you have any further ideas on controlling ivy? Oh, the ivy.
Oh, the ivy.
Seems to be a never-ending battle.
I know. I will say the one nice thing with ivy, because it is a shallow rooted plant, you can almost roll it once you get it started. I have removed large areas of ivy before. It's not fun at all. I know that. But it is possible. Just kind of starting from one edge and kind of getting like a pitchfork or something to kind of get the roots loosened. Doing it in the middle of the summer or towards the end of the summer, because it's been starved of water at that point and it's going to be stressed out. The root system isn't going to be um, as good, I guess, at that point. So getting it started, and you can actually fold it on itself and you can start to roll it and you like make like a little tube with it. So it is one way to do it. It is not an easy one. You'll have to come back a couple of times, but you will be able to tackle it. Putting a heavy mulch on top afterwards will also help to kind of smother it a bit.
Okay, any recommendations for plants that could withstand mowing every September while tackling blackberries? That's a good one.
Yeah, mowing every September.
While tackling blackberries.
I mean, there's different types of grasses. Just trying to think of other. I might have to do some research and get back to you on that one. So
Okay.
whoever sent that, if we can get your email, I can do a follow up on that and actually come up with a better idea of something specific. Because there is, I mean, there's things like vinca and like pachysandra that you can mow and will come back. I guess it would depend. Also, is it a shady spot or a sunny spot? Is it high moisture or is it a dry area? To what type of plant could survive there?
Okay, I have that person's email, so I will connect the two of you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Another question, you mentioned that a good snake habitat is tall grasses, but I'm finding it is also a good rat habitat. True. Are there any
Yeah.
other ways to invite garter snakes to my garden without also inviting rats?
Yeah, oftentimes they will like kind of, well, I was going to say some logs, which sometimes rats will like too. I would focus on trying to remove the other things that might be attracting rats. So if like thinking about rats like really large piles of debris, they're going to kind of burrow down in that sort of stuff. And then, like I mentioned, if you have really dense shrubbery, they're going to try and hide and burrow under that. Um, if you have a compost on site at your house, like a backyard composting, making sure you're not putting chunks of food in it and you're only doing yard waste. You can do like lids of lettuce, but don't put like whole apples in there because that is going to attract rats. And um, but other things, I mean, snakes, yeah, they like the tall grass. Like having some types of smaller branches down, so maybe not big piles, but like a foot by a couple of feet will help to create space because they do need something to kind of lay their eggs and burrow under too, which also is going to be good habitat for salamanders, which are another great guy to have for different types of insects to eat too.
Mhm. I've seen garter snakes burrow in strawberry plants before. They seem to
Mm-hmm.
really enjoy that.
Yeah.
And
Who doesn't want to?
I don't have any other questions at the moment, so I will just share. A friend of mine swears that he had a raccoon problem. Raccoons kept coming in his yard. He had an outdoor cat, which is not, a good mix. But he swears the raccoons really did not like being sprayed with the garden hose. And one of them ran up this really tall holly. Well, it's more like a holly tree than a holly bush now, but it stayed up there for an hour before it finally came down and then ran away. And he has not seen any raccoons in his yard since. So
Wow.
if all
Okay.
else fails, I
So
guess they don't really enjoy being sprayed with a hose.
get a super. This is all the more reason for adults to get like super soaker like water guns.
Yeah.
We can stand out there with our. I've thought about it with the squirrels. So that's another one I could mention is just squirrels. And being a problem. They're not necessarily along streams or shoreline areas, but they are a common pest in urban environments. So, and they are a
All right.
hard one to get rid of too.
Yeah. I have a resident squirrel that comes every day and has started actually, like, he stands on his little hind legs and looks through my sliding glass door at me like, are you going to come out and feed me or what?
Yeah. I have a squirrel nest in my front yard. So,
Okay, another question. I'm not willing to use poison for rats, but we're having trouble catching those near the chicken coop. Any ideas for that?
so I had problem with rats and chicken coops before. So a couple of things that I've done is at night, I made sure all the chickens were in their roost and locked up, and I put traps in the coop and was able to catch them from inside the coop. After I thought I got them all. They don't like to burrow super deep, they won't go much farther than a foot. So what you can do is dig a trench about 6 to 8 inches away from the coop and dig down about a foot, a little bit more. And then you can put chicken wire that goes all the way down, and they won't always burrow underneath it. And it's far enough away that they can't do kind of like a swoop underneath because it's too far for them to go. So that's one thing that worked for me,
Okay.
is just kind of making a trench and putting chicken wire around. The other thing is making sure with when you are feeding your chickens that you're not overfeeding the chickens where they're not able to eat all of the food that is right there. Like if you're putting scraps in for them to eat, making sure you don't have a whole bunch of the scraps still there 24 hours later will keep them away.
One of the participants mentioned that they've had a little luck with some strong peppermint oil to deter them.
Oh yeah, no, that would be great. And actually, thinking about rodents and oils or different spices, cayenne pepper is supposed to help with different types of rodents. So mixing cayenne pepper in a spray bottle with a little bit of either dish soap, like a couple of drops of dish soap or a teaspoon of like vegetable oil, and shaking that up can also help with your plants. If you have any sort of squirrels or rats that are trying to eat your plants, that's another thing you can try too.
Okay. And a question, any kind of tree or habitat that Douglas squirrels crave and encourage them to stay in Bothell?
Hmm. I don't know. I can't think of what specifically. I know one of the biggest problems is that they're being outcompeted by the other squirrels. So, um, that's another one I would have to look specifically for what their specific habitat requirements are for that guy. I don't remember off the top of my head.
Okay. No,
So
I'll connect.
I'm happy to follow up on that.
Sure, yes, I'll connect you two on that also. I don't see any other squirrels, or I don't see any squirrels in the chat box. I don't
No,
see any.
that would be a funny place for them to
Sorry,
be.
I'm sorry. I don't see any other questions in the chat box at this point. If anyone has a question and just wants to unmute to ask it, you're more than welcome to do that. We have, if you haven't taken the poll that we have right now, please take a moment or two to complete that also. And let's see what else we've got here. And this is, I mentioned this is the second of our workshop series. So next Wednesday, we have the third and final workshop of this year's series. And Selena is going to be talking about how to attract pollinators to your garden and how to create habitat that protects them and helps them thrive. And I know our first two workshops were, our target audience were people that lived along a stream in Bothell or another water body. But really this third workshop that we're doing, it doesn't matter if you have a stream near you or not. The information she's going to share is beneficial to whatever type of property you have and wherever you are. So we hope you'll join us for that too. And I think maybe we will give the polling one more minute and then close that. Selena, what is your least favorite noxious weed, or what's the one that's giving you the most trouble?
Buttercup,
Yeah.
the ranunculus, yeah, which I didn't touch on today because it doesn't directly impact streams. But that and morning glory, I think, are the
Oh
two that
gosh.
are the most frustrating. And so with buttercup, it is, oh, another thing to mention with invasive weeds and or just weeds in general is oftentimes they're indicator plants. So they can be an indication of what type of nutrients or soil quality you have in your area. And so specifically with ranunculus or the buttercup, they like compact, soggy soil.
Mhm.
And so one of the ways to get rid of them then is to build your soil and make it more healthy. But it can be really hard to get rid of them because their root system is so intertwining underneath, and it's really hard to get all of that root. And every little bit of root will start a new plant. So yeah, so tackling your soil, getting it less compact and draining better will help with those, but they are a pain in the butt to get out of. Mainly because they get into everything. So it's really hard to get them out. And then with the morning glory, they oftentimes are coming from other people's yards. And so you can only control a little bit of it because it's in whatever's in your own yard. And they also are very hard to get rid of because any root that is left behind will just grow a new plant. The one nice thing with them is that they do only grow their roots within the 4 to 6 top inches of soil. So what you can do is put a tarp or a really thick, heavy layer of mulch on top, and the roots will actually work their way up to that level. And then you can pull that off, and the root system will be right on top. And so you can take them, like easily remove them that way. But you just keeping up on them time after time, they can be a really big pain in the butt. But yeah.
And have you, this is just my own question, have you had any experience with large patches of knotweed? I know that the at least King County and Snohomish County, their noxious weed control programs. If you're not able to eradicate them, I know we want to stay away from chemicals and pesticides, but sometimes I've heard about people using injectors in knotweeds for control. Can you talk for just a minute about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, so a lot of the ones that I was mentioning, there is a chemical option, and they have been proven to be useful. I always want to and try and get people to do the other ways first.
Mhm.
But sometimes the best way to eradicate, especially if you have a really extensive large stand, is to do some sort of chemical option. Um, they all have different protocols, and in those two websites that I had, which I'm glad you added to my list, they have like the chemical, the mechanical, and the like biological different ways of controlling. So they have them all listed. They have very specific chemicals to use for each one and how to do it. And yes, the injectors are a common one for knotweed. And so what they do is they cut them down and they're able to target that plant specifically. So you're not fully pulling apart a shoreline, or if you're not spraying, broadcast spraying something, because that's when we have a lot of problems, is when you're doing a broadcast spray and you're hurting. It's easier for it to get into the water. It's easier to hurt and kill other types of native plants or other types of animals. So yeah, and a lot of, I know at least in King County, and I don't know about Snohomish County, sometimes you can rent the different types of devices for applying some of those chemicals. So definitely look into some of the county um, noxious weed sites and see if they have some program like that, uh,
Mhm.
to be able to rent some of those different types of things, because they do want people to help with this. We just don't have the funding to be able to tackle everything, so we need the help from everybody else.
Yeah, and when we had decided we were going to do this workshop, I checked. I know King County has a program. I wasn't sure about Snohomish County, but apparently they do also have a program where they will lend you those injectors. You, of course, have to pay for the
Mm-hmm.
chemicals, I believe, but they'll train you how to use them. I believe you have to take a class
Mm-hmm.
to do that. But yeah, we've
Yeah,
got those links on the resource page if that is an option that
yeah,
you need to pursue.
yeah, yeah. There is always a chemical option for everything, but just be very aware of what you are doing and how you are doing it, before you start.
I also added the Grow Smart, Grow Safe
Oh,
website
great.
to
Yep.
the, do you want to talk about that for just a second?
Yeah, so the Grow
Okay.
Smart, Grow Safe website is a website that helps list the different toxicity levels of different chemicals, both organic and not, so that you know if it's impacting, say, an aquatic environment, humans, the ecosystem, like the environment. It'll go through the different levels, and on a scale of, say, 1 to 5, what level it is impacting each of those areas. And then it will then give you the least toxic at the top versus the most toxic at the bottom. And you can search by pest or disease, or you can search by the chemical or the product. And it doesn't have everything on there, but it has a pretty large amount of different options to look at. So they'll tell you like clove oil for something, and then they'll say what it might possibly impact. And so clove oil is actually it's a organic product that you can use, but it is also can be harmful to a human because it can burn you. So just think, it gives you all of the range of options. So definitely a good one to look at if you are going to start looking at chemicals in any sort of way. Looking at that just so you know those direct impacts that they might have. Um, One thing that is a common one that people don't think about is copper for moss on roofs, and copper is a huge problem for aquatic animals. So it's oftentimes not recommended to have any sort of copper sprays or on your rooftops if you are really close to a waterway, because it can really impact the aquatic environments.
Yeah, plus it will run off of your roof. If you're using it to treat the moss on your roof anyway, then when it rains, that's going to run off. That's going to go down your storm drains and end up in the streams anyway, which either way we don't want. Someone's asking about recommended mulches. So Marilyn, I'm not sure. I think you came in a little late. We did have a slide about some mulches, but do you want to talk about any of your specific favorites, Selena, or mention, I don't know if I have the chip drop website on the resource page, but
Mm-hmm.
that's a free resource for
Yeah.
arborist chips anyway.
Yeah. Or Marilyn, do you want to turn on, you can unmute yourself and ask something more specific if you want.
Excuse me, I'm just interested in mulches that will help the ground, but also I've got morning glory and I have ivy.
All of the fun ones.
Yes, I'm so lucky. And we call it bindweed because I
Yep.
think it comes in the horse hay.
Yeah. Yeah. So there is two different kinds of bindweed or morning glory. So there's the smaller leaf, which is the more traditional bindweed, and then the morning glory, which is the bigger guy. And they both are terrible. They're both not fun. So yeah, the arborist chips are great, and that's one. So chip drop that Christy just mentioned, and it's a free resource. It is shredded up bits from arborists that have chopped down trees or branches. So you get leaves, you get sticks, you get wood, you get bark, you get everything all mixed together. It is a really, it's not a, let's see, what I'm trying to say. It's not a very fine-tuned product. So you're going to get a pine cone every once in a while, or it's really shredded. It's great for around trees and shrubs and used in pathways. One thing to kind of take note of with it is you don't always know exactly what you're going to get as far as the product in it. So you can request not to get certain products from them, and they can't guarantee it because it's whatever the arborist is going to be bringing, but they do try to not put that stuff in. I've used it for years and never had a problem. I would recommend not getting the black locust, black walnut, or laurel, because with laurel, sometimes you can get seeds that will be then in there, and then you're going to be spreading laurels, which are an invasive species. But the other things, any sort of kind of composted mulch is good. So it might have a little bit of compost, but will be more of a composted wood product, is going to be a good one to put down for shrubs and trees. If you're doing a more like a vegetable bed, a compost is going to be your best bet for that. So
yeah,
one other out there.
One other thing about chip drop is, unless you have a huge area that you need to use the chips on, you might want to get together with some neighbors, because when they drop a load off for you, it tends to be a gigantic load, like a truckload.
Yeah, it'll be 8 to 10 yards, which is a lot. So that's just, so something to be aware of for that. I would say if you are in kind of like a very woodland type area, chip drop is probably going to be your best bet, because you can really pack, you could do 3 or 4 inches of that, and it will break down. It will take some time, but that's what we like about it, is the leaves help to kind of add some nitrogen into the mix of the wood products to help quicken that decomposing process, versus just big chunks of wood, which just is a slower process to decompose. So, yeah.
All right. I think we are right at time. Thank you so much for all the wonderful information, Selena. And thank you everyone for joining us and your great questions. Tomorrow is Earth Day. I believe it's the 51st anniversary. So happy Earth Day to everyone.